We're going to get started this morning. First, a call out to that suit right there. Happy holidays, everyone. Don't look without your sunglasses. I did buy this hat in Moscow after I certified the most recent presidential election. I thought you'd want to know. I've worn it twice, once at a Timbers game who are playing in the finals tonight in Atlanta, and once today because it's chilly out there. So thanks again for showing up on this bright and sunny and cool morning. My name is Paul Gronke. I am a professor of political science at Reed College. I direct the Early Voting Information Center. I'm also on the advisory board of MEDSL. So I'd like to thank Charles for allowing me to attend. I was one of those tardy attendees, but I squeezed my way in the door. So thanks again, and I'm pleased to be able to moderate this morning's session. So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. My role here is really just to keep everyone on time and get us out at the end of the session. So we'll move through from my far right through to the closest to me, and then I hope we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to start by introducing Josh Benaloh. Josh is the senior cryptographer at Microsoft Research. He's also an affiliate faculty member at the University of Washington. He received his BA at that other school in Cambridge, MIT.
BS, actually. There's no such thing as a BA
BS,
here.
thank you. BS, it does say BS here. He got his MA and PhD at Yale. His 1987 dissertation was titled Verifiable Secret Ballot Elections, introduced the use of homophoric encryption.
Something like that.
That's what it says. A way to enable election tallies to be checked by voters, activist citizens without relying on election machines. Michael Alvarez actually noted just before we started that this was really one of the first and earliest pieces looking at election technology, applying computer science knowledge to understanding elections. So really one of the early movers in the field. Josh also serves on the coordinating committee of the Election Verification Network. Your bio said you're the author of the September 2018 report, Securing the Vote by the National Academy.
An author.
I think an author is correct.
There are a lot of other authors in here. If I said the...
a wonderful report that you really should look at.
There are at least 3 others in the room.
Is Ron Rivest here?
Yes, right there.
So I heard last night that Josh got Ron started working on, that wasn't what the story was. In 1981, apparently Josh was a pup undergrad in Ron Rivest's course on cryptography, which foolishly got Josh interested in elections. And here he is today. So thank you. Next is Michael Alvarez. Michael Alvarez received his BA at Carleton, his PhD at Duke University, currently serves as a professor of political science at Caltech. He's the co-director of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. Most of you are familiar with this project. Really one of the first, I think, academic efforts to try to improve the integrity and security of American elections after 2000. Mike studies electoral politics and voting behavior. His recent research is focused on voter advice applications and how these may influence turnout. Mike is a fellow of the Society for Political Methodology and has been recognized by Scientific American for outstanding acts of leadership in science and technology, and was, until recently, the co-editor of Political Analysis. He has stepped down from that role after many years. Next up is Michael McDonald. Michael is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida, Director of the United States Election Project. Mike tweets at Elect Project. Michael received his BS from Caltech and his PhD from UC San Diego. Mike's research is into his research interests include elections and methodology. Michael has worked for National Exit Poll organizations, consulted for the EAC, and has worked as an expert witness in many lawsuits and cases concerning voting rights and redistricting. And finally, Whitney Quesenbery. Whitney is the co-director of the Center for Civic Design, passionate about improving the election and the voter experience. 15 years after she was appointed to the EAC's Federal Advisory Commission, I think that was the first national voting system guidelines. Whitney reports she is still grappling with the best way to approach the design for democracy. She wants me to highlight the center's work to introduce best practices guides through the field guides for ensuring voter intent. I assume everyone has that little stack. I have it.
If you don't, we'll send it to you.
It's a great little stack of books. My problem is my undergrads keep walking away at my copies.
Oh,
so.
Just tell me you need more. We'll send them.
Currently, Whitney's involved in working on plain language versions of the California Voter Bill of Rights, improving vote by mail and absentee envelopes, and modernizing voter registration. So we will start with Josh and move down the line and hopefully keep on time. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. So like many of the academics here, I don't know if it's possible for me to speak sitting down, so I'm going to have to speak upward. And also, I want people to be looking at the slides, so the higher I am, the easier it is for you to look up there. I don't know, if this work is really placed well here. I'm talking about not a comprehensive audit so much as an alternative to what we were hearing about all day yesterday. RLAs, Bayesian audits are a very important kind of thing. I want them done. I want every contest and every election to have an audit of this sort. I describe these audits as administrative audits. These are internal audits conducted by election administrators. And they're really good things to have. I want them done everywhere, but they're not perfect. There are some things missing, and I'm going to talk about some deficiencies and some alternatives. So in particular, in one of these administrative audits, they're not very effective if the election administrators themselves are careless, if they're malicious, if they don't maintain good chain of custody of the ballots themselves, then it's a problem. If the tools that are used for a risk-limiting audit, say, are not independent of the tools that are used for the initial counting, then you've got a fundamental problem. You could imagine something where the original counting tool has a malicious or maybe erroneous situation where if you vote for A for president and B for governor, but not C for Secretary of State, then it's going to flip the top-level race. And the same thing will happen on the auditing software, and it's very likely that nobody will ever notice it. So unless you have good independence, you have a problem there. So that's another thing you have to worry about. But basically what you need in any sort of administrative audit is trust of the administrators. If I don't trust my election administrators, then an RLA really isn't going to give me a lot of confidence, because there are all sorts of things that could be done that might be nefarious or accidental. How do I flip the paper? I'm not flipping the votes on the paper. What I'm doing is, when the initial count was done, I flipped the top vote when a ballot was structured according to a certain pattern. When people entered, they saw the paper, they entered it, what was on the paper, but then the recording there flipped after you enter it. It just recorded it as a flip at the same time.
Isn't calculated correctly.
Exactly.
By whatever's accounting.
Yes. Yeah. So it's possible to do that. I'm not saying I've ever seen it done. I'm not saying it's likely to happen right in the near future. But if there are a lot of RLAs, it could be done.
Forgive me for interrupting.
No, please, please.
In principle, the original cast vote record.
You have to tell him not to do that. He does it to everyone.
The act of entering the data from the physical paper should both be observable by the public.
In principle, yes, and that could make this harder, but it's a threat, and it's something we have to be aware of. So I want to talk about an alternative that's also not perfect, but it actually complements this well, and it's possible to have a technology that enables any inaccuracies in an election to be detected. And I'm not just talking about known inaccuracies. I'm talking about any possible tampering, changing of tallies can be detected. And when I say detected, I'm not just speaking of detected by election officials, detected by any observer, by voters themselves, by candidates, by media outlets. Anybody can themselves, without aid, detect an anomaly. And the anomaly is not just an external anomaly that we're worried about, not just an FSB attack, but you can detect internal tampering, tampering by election officials or equipment vendors who may have made a mistake or, again, be malicious, or the equipment itself. Any kind of tampering can be detected. Now, the technology that does this is known as end-to-end verifiability. It's a terrible name. I'm sorry. I'm not responsible for the name. I'd love something better, but this is what it's come to be known as. And end-to-end verifiability is a definition. It's actually not a technology. It's sort of a set of technologies that meet this definition. And the definition is twofold. The first is that voters can themselves verify that their own votes have been properly recorded. Okay? The second part is that anyone can verify that the recorded votes have been properly tallied. And this is, in some sense, the most you can reasonably hope to do. You might want to say, well, anyone should be able to verify that my vote has been correctly recorded, but that seems to require that you know my vote or my selections to be able to verify that. Okay? That's the trickiness. So this seems to be just about the most that we can imagine being able to do. Now, I'd love to give you a long detail and go into depth on this, but I don't really have enough time, so I'll just do a quick overview. But before I do, I want to emphasize what is really, in some sense, the thing that makes elections hard from a technical standpoint. I know there are lots of other aspects, but the counting process is hard because of privacy. There's an enhanced version of privacy required in elections beyond what's true for banking or medical records or other things. For an election, I should not be able to show anybody else how I voted, even if I want to. I can show other people my medical records and my bank statement, but I can't show you how I voted. I can make a claim, but I can't convince you. That's really hard to make happen. And if we didn't have that property, elections would be so much easier. Here's sort of a quick sense of what things looked like back in the 19th century, before we had secret ballot elections. Many people don't realize that most US presidents were elected without the benefit of a secret ballot. And I can go into the history. There are some history people in the room, which is great, but this is, the secret ballot and the lack of the secret ballot is why the number of US presidents doesn't match the number of the US president, because Grover Cleveland was elected the 22nd and the 24th presidents, and the intervening term when Benjamin Harrison won, it was because of corruption in open ballot elections that was changed that allowed Cleveland to come back and become the 24th president. Anyway, what I encourage the election officials in this room to do is think about, what if we didn't have privacy? In theory, I'm not going to encourage it, but if we didn't have voter privacy, if it was an open ballot, what would a good high-integrity election look like? What would you do? And I'd suggest what you would likely do is something like this. You would publish a website with everybody's vote that everybody can look at. And then how I vote is almost irrelevant. I could vote in person, I could vote by mail, I could vote over the internet, I could vote by carrier pigeon. It doesn't matter. As long as I get the information to the election office can post a list on a website, and I can look at the website and see my vote and see that it's accurate. And I can see everybody else's vote and see that they came from registered voters, and registration lists are a different issue. But I could see that who they came from and check it all out and know that they've had an opportunity to check, and I can count it all up for myself. And it's great. I could do everything. This would be a modern 19th century election in some sense. And it's got great properties. This has all the properties of end-to-end verifiability. You can check that your vote is correct. You can check that the counting is correct. Done. Except we want secrecy in our ballots. We really want secrecy for very good reason. So what do? It's actually a very small step from here to a secret ballot election. And one little trick, and a few things to make the trick work. And the trick is to take this election up here and add a layer of encryption. So you can't really see what's under there now. It's hidden. So we don't publish people's actual votes. We publish encryptions of people's votes. Now we have two things that we have to figure out how to do. One is we have to figure out a way that Carol can be confident that that encryption, those inscrutable symbols next to her name, really do match her selections. And we have to have a way that anybody can check that that set of encrypted ballots really does correspond to the tally correctly. Now I'm going to give you a very quick sense of this part, because it's kind of fun and quick. The other part I'll skip over. We can come back to. This part is the evil word, homomorphic tallying. I'll explain that in a second. But the idea is votes are just zeros and ones, right? Zeros for the candidates you didn't select, ones for the candidates you did select, in almost all instances. Well, counting an election, tallying, is just addition. Just dumb elementary school addition, nothing more. You add up down the columns. Well, suppose that we have encryptions of all these things. You can do something where you take the encryptions and you compute on the encrypted data directly, and you get an encryption of the data as though it were unencrypted. So this fancy word, homomorphic encryption, that you may have heard, is really nothing more than academics being a little erudite and trying to seem important. It's just sort of two-column accounting. It's saying that if you do something on the left, you get the same thing that would happen if you do something on the right. Now, the symbol on the right is maybe the way you combine the encrypted values is not the same. You apply some special operation. Well, it turns out that that special operation in virtually all cases is multiplication. Simple elementary school multiplication to combine the encrypted votes to get an encryption of the tally. Now, why multiplication? Math can be funny sometimes. It works out a little bit better if you multiply the encryptions to get an encryption of the sum. But once you've got this, then the way that you conduct an election is everybody votes. The votes are encrypted. There will be ways that people can check the encryptions are correct. You take those encryptions, you literally just multiply them together with that special secret symbol that we're using on the right. We multiply them together. We decrypt that aggregate encrypted value, and that's the tally of the election. And everybody can do that on their own and check that. They can check that multiplication. They can check that everything is good. Okay? Because everything works out. The left column matches the right column. So this is how we've done the mathematical proof. The other side of this, the showing that your vote is correctly recorded, I'm not going to show you now, but I can use exactly the same cards that Philip used yesterday for the demonstration. Nice little card tricks. No math at all involved. And there are a lot of ways of doing this, but a lot of them have no math. Okay? So where are we with this? This is nothing new. As Paul said at the beginning, 1987, we had the basics of this. Homomorphic encryption for elections, more than 30 years old. They've been around for decades, and there are actually several ways of doing this. I've described one way, but there are a lot of different ways of achieving this technology. But there are new refinements that have come along in the past few years that make this practical and doable, and this is just at a great time because we really have the need right now. So there have been some instantiations of this, some deployments. It's important to talk about Helios, especially with Ben right here. Ben is the person who's actually done a lot of this implementation for Helios, which is an internet version of end-to-end verifiability, which has been used for millions of votes now, as I understand it, all over the world. Private elections, because it's over the internet, and there are concerns with internet voting, but end-to-end verifiability can be used for internet voting. It doesn't solve all the problems of internet voting. Another example is Scantegrity, which was used in Tacoma Park, Maryland for a few trials. It's a really nice system. It has good usability. At least I think it has good usability. Maybe Whitney, where are you? You might disagree. But yeah, it has some interesting properties. It seemed to work well. Voters liked it a lot. Another possibility is star vote you may have heard about. When far down the road, this was for Austin, Texas, we were really gung-ho on having this happen. It got canceled earlier this year due mostly to lack of funding. And the irony there is that this would have cost less in the end, but it was the upfront development costs that caused this to fall through. And the reason this would have cost less in the end is that this end-to-end verifiable paradigm shifts the structure of elections from certifying election equipment to certifying actual elections. You can run the election on any equipment. You don't have to check the equipment in some sense. All you need to do is check that the equipment produced a good election by checking the election itself. And that means you can use off-the-shelf equipment. You don't have to get the expensive, certified, overpriced equipment and the onerous maintenance contracts. Okay, I'll quickly say a few years ago, the US Vote Foundation published a study looking at end-to-end verifiability in the context of internet voting. The conclusions were you should never do internet voting without end-to-end verifiability, but you shouldn't be doing internet voting in public elections today. Even with end-to-end verifiability, we're not ready for it. There are several other significant problems to be addressed. The new VVSG, the guidelines that NIST is developing for the EAC, talk about end-to-end verifiability because of a compromise that was struck a few years ago in Silver Springs, Maryland. The EAC basically brought together election security advocates who've been saying we need paper, and election accessibility advocates who have been saying paper is no good for blind voters. It's a non-starter there. Paper is no good if you have motor skill disabilities, et cetera. And the compromise that was reached was paper is a fine medium. If you're not going to use paper, you need some other mechanism for ensuring validity, verifiability of an election. End-to-end verifiability can provide that. So if you don't have paper, you must have end-to-end verifiability to have a compliant system. So I'm going to quickly give, the second to last slide, sort of a comparison between these two approaches, which, again, I say complement each other well. I'm going to look at the downsides of everything as much as possible. So I'm reversing things. So if you talk about the audits we've been talking about all day yesterday, they do have the deficit of the requirement of trusting the election administrators. They also are somewhat cumbersome, much less so than traditional audits, but somewhat cumbersome to go through it and process after an election. That's the exercise we did yesterday. Compared to end-to-end verifiability, which is just software. Basically, you push a few buttons before the election, the software does everything. You push a few buttons after the election, you don't have these big ceremonies with lots of people involved, checking ballots, et cetera. That's up to voters themselves. Anybody who wants to check can do the check themselves. On the other side of it, the end-to-end verifiability, all that software, is hard to build. Ben has done it, but it's a far more involved process than the things that have been done to date. Doing this for production-level systems is a challenge, and there's a lot of work to be done, and it's not going to be cheap the first time. Hopefully, as it gets out there, it can be used over and over. It's software. It can be repeated, but getting it built is going to be expensive. Also, you think RLAs are hard to explain? Yeah. This is going to be a challenge. This is even a good deal harder to explain, to understand for voters, for election administrators. This is a real challenge. We've been working on the pedagogy, but still, this is, in some sense, the biggest problem. So I'm going to close with just sort of the comparison checklist. My ideal audits are in person, either hand-marked or BMDs. Both of them, you can do risk-limiting audits and end-to-end verifiability on the same election. Everything's there. You get this great complementary effect. You have the nice property that you don't need paper to do end-to-end verifiability. So you can use this for in-person paperless. You can use it for internet voting, even though I don't want to use that for public elections. On the other hand, I don't know a good way of doing end-to-end verifiability with vote by mail. So if you've got vote by mail, you can still do an RLA. You can't do end-to-end verifiability in a practical way that I know of. So trade-offs, interesting possibilities. Again, ideally together, but you've got some choices. And that's all I've got.
So maybe we just switch. That's great. Is it possible to make that full screen? 'Cause I can't see.
Yeah, it will be.
No,
oh,
but
sorry.
here,
Oh,
from the view,
Yeah, it's up
I
there.
just can't see very well.
Yeah, I was having that problem.
Yeah, my eyesight's not great.
How do you code for
No,
ranked
it's fine.
choice voting if it's only binary?
Oh, it doesn't have to be just binary. That was just the, yeah.
All right, sorry about that short delay. It's just I can't see super well, so the screen is really small. What I'm going to talk about is actually very complementary to what Josh talked about. Again, as Josh started by saying, the type of audits we talked about yesterday, I agree absolutely. Every jurisdiction should be doing them. It's an important component of verifying the integrity of an election. What we're trying to do in this project is to focus on the other parts of the election. Maybe you could think of this as an end-to-end sort of verifiability, or as Philip mentioned yesterday, confirming the inputs that go into the audit. There's a lot of different ways to conceptualize what we're talking about. But what we're talking about is trying to develop a process that will allow you to audit the entire election that you're running. And to do so, hopefully, in a way that doesn't involve all of the encryption, that is easy for people to understand, in particular easy for our colleagues in election administration to understand, but also voters. That can be done in a very public and open way. And that it involves typically the outputs of the election that you're already producing. Okay, so those were sort of the goals of this project, and I'm going to try to run through that pretty quickly. So this all started back, in work that we were doing in New Mexico. Lonnie Atkinson, Thad Hall, and I were doing a number of evaluation projects in New Mexico, looking at poll worker surveys, voter surveys, looking at the audits and trying to help New Mexico develop its post-election audit process. And we wrote this book, Evaluating Elections. In that book, we walk through all of these different methodologies and talk about their relative utility for trying to understand the performance of a particular election. And one of the key things that we learned as we were going through all this is the concept that elections are really data, right? When you're running an election, you're generating an enormous amount of data. And so again, what's interesting about Josh and I's talk is he's talking about mathematical formal cryptography. We're going to talk about data science now. And I think Michael's going to talk a little bit about data science too, so we're sort of spanning those spectrums. So again, elections are about data. And a lot of that data gets released to the public or is data that you can make available to researchers. So our goal in this project was to figure out how best to use all of that information to try to help confirm the integrity of an election. Now, comprehensive election audits. Some of the issues that we run into, and we've been doing this project with Neil Kelly in Orange County, and I'll talk a little bit more about the details of that. Some of the kind of open questions. This project is still ongoing. They just certified the election like last week. We're still getting a lot of information coming in. We're still working to parse through a lot of the data that we have. We have a website. It's monitoringtheelection.us, where you can go and see a lot of the reports that we've been producing. But some of the issues that we've encountered, of course, the first issue is trust. I'm not going to put that on, I didn't put that on the slide. But as an academic, we really have to find election officials who trust us. Luckily, I've got a good relationship with Neil. Neil's a fantastic person to work with. And again, that's one of the most difficult things working in this area where I've worked since 98, is developing trust with election officials so that you will provide us with the information that we need to do this kind of project. One of the problems, of course, is academics work on a different time scale than election officials. You have to certify that election, within weeks. We work on time scales of months and years and things like that. So trying to produce some of the outputs I'll talk about in a really timely manner so that the data and the analyses that we're doing can be actionable by election officials in real time is a real trick. And we've tried to do our best with that. And again, I'd be happy to talk more specifically about that later. And we also want to make this data available at the moment in time when the public and the stakeholders and the media are focused on the election, right? We want people to be able to get this kind of information so that they know immediately that in a place like Orange County, where we had some of the most competitive congressional races in the country, that election was conducted with a high degree of integrity. So there's no concerns about the integrity of those competitive elections. Timeliness is really important. Transparency is important. And so, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the data that's available on Neil's website, or get data feeds from Neil, or produce our own data, but put public reports on our website as quickly as we can that show the data and that try to do so in a very easily understandable way, and try to make these reports available to the public as quickly as we can. Low cost. I talked a little bit about cost yesterday. We want to make this process, obviously, on our side, it's going to be pretty costly because we're going to be doing this. There's a lot of personnel costs that go into it. But we want to make it easy for our election official colleagues to collaborate with us, to provide us with these data, to provide us with the information, but most importantly, provide us with feedback. I'll have to tell you, that was one of the most difficult things that we encountered in this process, is that we want Neil and his team to give us feedback. When there's data that they're providing, when we have questions about the data, there's a result that we may not understand, we need his team's feedback immediately. And of course, they're preoccupied with running the election, right? They don't have a lot of time and bandwidth for that. So figuring out how we can do these things in a more automated way, in particular, get access to high quality data streams before the election, get that all squared away before we want to run these kinds of comprehensive audits, is really important. And last, again, we really need to make this actionable. I mean, I can't stress that enough. I mean, to me, the important goal here, obviously, is I'm an academic. I want data. I want to publish this stuff eventually, right? We have grad students working on this. They have to write their dissertation. So there's an imperative on the academic side. But the real goal here is making all of this information actionable for our colleagues in the election space. So we're always trying to provide information back to Neil and his team as quickly as we can as to what we're finding. In fact, we're going to go down and meet with Neil and his team on Monday to do a little bit of a debrief as to what we've been finding and how this project worked. So what do we do in Orange County? So again, we've collaborated with Neil, and Neil's just been a fabulous person to work with. Again, the goal was to really test a whole series of different approaches for trying to confirm as many of the steps in the process that we possibly could, using readily available data, or using other data that was relatively easiest for us to access from Neil, or data that we could generate ourselves. So why OC? Of course, it's close to Pasadena. It's like 65 miles direct. It's like 3 hours in the car, LA traffic. But it's a great county. It's a large, diverse county. California, as you know, many of these jurisdictions are going through really important procedural, administrative, and technological change. So one of the great things about our project with Orange County is we've established a really kind of interesting baseline data set that we can use in the future. Those competitive congressional races were, of course, an important part of the project. We really wanted to be doing this in a place where it would matter, where we were generating data that could really help confirm the integrity of elections in some of the most competitive elections in the country. Neil's team generates a lot of data, which is the other interesting thing that really helps us a lot. They generate an enormous amount of data. A lot of it goes on their website, and we were able to access a lot of these data streams. And again, Neil's just a great person to work with. Neil doesn't mind taking a little risk, and a little risk. We tried to minimize his risk, but he doesn't mind taking a little risk, and he really, I think, enjoys the collaboration. So he was really a wonderful person to work with. So we're backing up. Okay, so project website, I've already mentioned that. The project launched in April. Now, we had a June primary, so it wasn't launched too far in advance of the primary, unfortunately. It would have been great to have a little more time. But again, that's when we launched it. And then we used the primary and the general election as kind of test beds for figuring out what data we could collect, what data we could get access to from Neil, and what data we could generate on our own. Let's see. Sorry. And I think I've talked about most of this. I mean, again, the goal was to use these data streams, put them on the website as quickly as we could, and then to get as much feedback as we could in real time from Neil, but also in the intervening period between the primary and the general election. And primaries in California are very complicated with our top 2 system. But we wanted to get a lot of feedback from what we did in the primary so we could improve and implement better audit methods in the November election. And again, we're optimistic that we're going to continue this project into 2020, which is going to be a whole nother, I won't use the term, but it's going to be a competitive race in Orange County, Southern California. Components. So again, you can go on the website and see what we've done. Basically, we have put the public reports that we've generated in what we call dashboards. There's a June dashboard and there's a November dashboard. The reports are just PDFs. You can download them. We put them up as quickly as we can. We update them as quickly as possible. For the November election, almost everything is up at this point. There's a couple of pieces of things we haven't released yet because we're getting some feedback from Neil on our voter surveys. But for each election, what did we do? We tracked mail ballots. Neil puts data on his website about mail ballots, and so we just produced some simple graphics to kind of help folks better understand how many ballots went out, how many have been returned. And that's, those are simple metrics that like the media and some of the stakeholders like to track. Neil has a tracker on his website as well, but again, providing some sort of independent, more readily useful information we thought was a good idea. We did in-person observation. Okay, so we're also doing qualitative work as well as the data science. So literally we had teams, and Daniel, some of you have met Daniel Guth. Raise your hand, Daniel, grad student at Caltech. He took part in some of these. He actually spent the whole day on election day in precincts in Orange County with a fellow grad student, doing in-person election observation. And those reports are available on our website. Talking about what we did and what we found. It's a very, very valuable experience to combine with the data that we're observing. We also did some forensic work. It's a lot like what Walter was talking about yesterday, not the deep data science, but the very basic kind of just let's look at the distributions of the data. And if you go on the website, you'll see that we found some interesting things, in particular from the statement of votes and the turnout reports that again, were very helpful to Neil to see. And then we also have done a bunch of survey work after the general election using emails. We did an online survey. We also did a panel survey using a paid panel of Orange County registered voters. And again, those data are data that we haven't released yet. They're in process. So what do some of these things look like? This is from our Twitter tracker. We also tracked Twitter data. This is the national tracker, just to show you this is election day traffic on Twitter. This is pretty complicated stuff. I can talk more about the utility of this. Whether or not it's useful for a specific election jurisdiction is an issue that we're trying to understand better right now. Again, this is data from basically the whole Twitter streaming API. We have to actually run multiple monitors on multiple machines because Twitter rate limits the information you can get back. But again, you can see this on our website. We stopped the tracker, or we stopped the display of it. This was going up in real time every day. So it was updated every day throughout the election. And it provides a lot of useful information as to what people are saying. And again, Walter talked about this yesterday, so I won't drill too deeply into it. We also did, and I think this is one of the most interesting things that we did, we focused a lot of attention and energy on voter registration database auditing. Now, starting in April, Neil's team provided us a snapshot of their voter registration database and vote history every day. We weren't getting it daily, we were getting it in chunks, but they were saving the snapshots for us. And what we would do is when we would get the snapshots, we basically would accumulate those as time series data over time and look for changes in the file. Look for all sorts of different kinds of changes. Okay, thank you. I'll be done in just a second. And this, I think, in the end, was something that was very, very useful to Neil because as, I can't remember, it was Charles talked about yesterday morning, California has recently changed some voter registration practices and moved towards a new process at DMV for motor voter registration. That has generated a lot of issues with our voter file. And so Neil really wanted to really make sure we were tracking those particular kinds of issues. Given the concerns about hacks on voter registration databases, we also wanted this tool to be in place to try to see if there was any malicious activity. We're tracking changes over time, so we're looking for records that are coming into the file, new records. We're looking for records that get dropped, and more importantly, we're looking for records that have components of the record that change over time. Addresses, party registration, age, all those fields. So our algorithm checks for those. We built up a considerable time series now of these data, so we can put a statistical anomaly detection routine on top of that and find days or events that look anomalous statistically compared to what we've seen in the past. We then generate those reports, we send them to Neil. Okay, so his team gets to see those first. And then when we see anomalies, we talk with Neil, they investigate them. They've actually investigated some of the things that we found. And the good news is that every time we've seen an anomaly, it actually traces back to administrative procedures or administrative manipulations that their team has conducted with the data. So that was the good news. This, I think, is a really useful tool, and I'm more than happy to talk about this with anybody who's interested. And I'd be really happy to collaborate with other election officials to try to get access to these data moving forward into 2020. I think it's a pretty valuable tool for you all. And we have a paper that we're working on this, and we'll be trying to publish and disseminate as much of this as we can. And hopefully Neil will talk to you about it at some point too at all the conferences you all go to. So I'm going to wrap really quickly. This is where we're at right now. We're trying to evaluate these different tools. And I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but we're trying to say, okay, well, which ones are timely? Which ones are low cost? Which ones are effective? Which ones do we think are useful to Neil? I'm going to show this table to Neil on Monday and see what he thinks. But I think, again, some of these tools are useful. I think they've worked well for us. Again, the voter registration audit tool being one of them. Some of the forensics that we've been able to do, I think, are timely, and they're low cost to Neil and make no cost whatsoever to him. They're easy for the public to understand and use. Some of the other things are a bit more costly, like, for example, surveying voters. Takes a bit of time and effort, and there's a bit of a cost, especially for academics, because we have to go through our institute review boards. There's a lot of hurdles that we have to cross in order to collect that kind of data. But we're trying to evaluate this project in this way, thinking of it in terms of this matrix, which is kind of funny. It's almost like the exact same slide Josh ended on. We will be, conducting our own evaluation, talking to Neil about this. We're putting together a comprehensive report on the project. And again, this is the sort of thing that we're going to be thinking about in terms of what we're going to propose moving forward. So this is a dynamic and ongoing project. I wish I had, more conclusive things to say, but I'm really excited about talking to anybody who wants to chat about this today or in the future. So again, ongoing project moving forward. You'll see more about this both on the project's website. We'll also be talking about it through some of the VTP channels. So again, just stay tuned, and we'll let you know how it all shakes out. Thank you. It's okay. It's fine.
Yeah, stand. All right, so this is work that I'm doing with a graduate student who just recently graduated from University of Florida, Brian Amos. He's great data science, GIS skills. Of course, he's looking for a job. So, and at this point, any of the election officials out there that may need someone with that skill set, I would recommend him highly, very highly. He's got excellent skills. And I'm going to completely change gears, I guess, and maybe even like tracks, but there is a relationship here. Of course, we may want to verify that someone cast a ballot and that's who they voted for is the correct people, that's being tracked correctly and tabulated correctly. But what if in the very first place they voted for the wrong people? And this is not a hypothetical. This has actually happened a couple times in recent elections. In Virginia, there was a very close House of Delegates election, and part of the outcome of that election was dependent on the fact that there were some voters there who cast ballots in the wrong district. And more recently, we just had a do-over election in Georgia, where again we had people who were casting ballots in the wrong election. And so what we were interested in is how could we develop tools to detect when registered voters have been assigned to the wrong districts. Of course, this is much related to redistricting, which is another thing that I do quite a bit on, and I'll talk a little bit at the end too about what might be some solutions here. But redistricting is the laying out of the district boundaries, and so we need to know where those district boundaries are. We need to know where the voters are located, and we need to make sure that voters are contained, corralled, if you will, within those district boundaries. And so what I'll first talk just very briefly about is how those boundaries are defined, because that's part of the data that we need to understand in order to understand how these errors can occur. So one is something called meets and bounds. This is where literally the law will say, go down Main Street to the oak tree, well, maybe nothing that bad, and then take a left and go out Route 1 for a while, and literally that's the description that you will find in some states as to what their district boundaries are. The other way to do this is with census geography. And census geography, basically what the census does is it defines geographically it tiles the entire country, at a very fine level called the census block, the geography of the country. And here you're just looking at numbers, would appear to be numbers, but these numbers really do have a relationship back to physical locations, and there's GIS data that makes that correspondence so that when you're drawing districts, or precincts for that matter, because re-precincting is very similar to redistricting, that you have this defined in terms of data. And if you look back here at the meets and bounds, if you look very closely, there's a census place designation that's listed in there too. So meets and bounds have started to encompass some census geography as well over time. But census geography, that's what many states do. In fact, some states do their redistricting with census geography, and then they convert that into meets and bounds because that's what's required within state law. So it's less precise in some ways, and that does actually lead to some of the errors that can happen. Just one other thing about census geography, in a typical state, mid-sized state, you're looking at hundreds of thousands of census blocks. They're about the size of a city block. That's why we think of them as blocks. But they include road medians, streams, very small bits of geography as well. So there are a tremendous number of census blocks when you look at a particular jurisdiction. And some jurisdictions even will split those as well. So that creates a whole other headache as far as what you're doing with the data. So how are voters assigned to districts? Well, there is a sort of meets and bounds approach that some election officials use. They use street segments. And there will be a master address file that election officials will have, and it'll list every segment that pertains to that's related to each district. And so here's an example where we have a district that goes down Main Street in the first 100 to 200 block, and then it cuts the 200 block on maybe the south side there, and you would have a file that would tell you that 100 to 198, because that would be the even side of the street, belongs in District 1, and then District 2 might be that blue district, and it would have 101, 121, or 101 all the way up to 199 or 299, or actually these segments would be incremental like that. So that's one method by which election officials identify precinct boundaries and how they assign voters to districts as well. The other way is to do it through kind of like the census geography approach, which is to geographically locate people, to take their addresses, to have boundaries, and to identify people within those units of geography. And so it's very similar in respects to redistricting approach, but it involves doing some geocoding of addresses, and that's the approach that we're going to take. And I'm going to explain. Certainly that check can detect some of the errors. So what do? This is what we take a address list from a voter registration file, we geocode it, we outlay the district boundaries, and then we just do a simple geographic merge on the data and identify any address that is falling outside of the prescribed district boundary, because the voter registration files have district identifiers in them too. And so if that district identifier for that address is not consistent with where that house is located or address is located on when we overlay the district boundaries, that tells us that we have a potential problem. And I say potential because there are some issues with this as well. One of the things that we've learned through this process is that you need to use more than one geocoding database. And so I know some election officials use this approach. They may have internal reports that they do. One of the recommendations I would make and come back to at the end as well is just to say, don't rely on just one geocoding database. They are proprietary in most cases, and not all geocoders give you the same results. The other thing about them is that voter files tend to have legacy addresses more frequently, and ironically, we found using the same geocoding database, legacy database, actually gave us more complete coverage of the addresses that are correctly geocoded, or at least geocoded, than if we just use the most current geocoding database. So we layer multiple geocoders on top of one another to try to get as much coverage as we can. And it has some things to do with the peculiarities of the data and properties of the data and how it's being generated both on the side of the election officials and with the geocoder databases that are produced by commercial vendors. Be happy to talk with more about that if you're interested. I'm going to skip this one. I mean, one of the issues, well, I won't skip it. One of the issues that we have with geocoders is that if you have the point address, there's different levels of accuracy with geocoding. One is that some vendors gone out there and maybe got an assessor database from a locality and can tell you exactly where the latitude and longitude points are of the rooftop of a building. And that's great. That's the most accurate thing that you can have. But you can have these other, what if you don't have that information? Well, the geocoders use algorithms, and one of the issues that you can find with an algorithm is that they have to guess, and so they'll say, oh, 100 to 200, and this was address 150, so I'm going to guess that the street, the address is located midway within the street segment, and I need to also guess that there's some setback from the street as to where the house is located. And this is an example of where there's a house that's very much set back. I don't know if I get the laser pointer to work. Very much set back from the main road, and so the geocoder would have placed the home here, but the home actually exists over here across a district boundary. And so you have to be careful about, these are the sorts of errors that you can get with geocoders when you have to understand these setbacks and other algorithms that are used if you don't have that rooftop accuracy. When we ran this algorithm, and we've done this now in Florida and Colorado, what we've actually detected people misassigned to districts, And we've worked with election officials to fix those errors, so that's great. And I don't. Maybe you could figure out where this is. I'm not going to tell you exactly where these places are, because the election officials have been very generous to verify for us that when we brought problems with them, to verify that yes, we detected a problem and worked to fix the problem. So that's the good news. The other good news I'll tell you about all of the examples I'm about to show you is that none of them affected, as far as we can tell, an election outcome, but there were people who were voting in the wrong district. That is also true as well. So here's a good example of where we geocoded, and we have this locality is using street segments to identify which districts people are located in. And these blue dots are one district, and then there's this one street segment right here that got misassigned. And the election officials said, yeah, our bad. When we were doing our updates after the last redistricting, we just failed to assign these street segments here to this district. And so these folks, they failed to update so that they were in the yellow district where everybody else is located. So this is just human operator error, that when you have these street segment approach, someone's got to go through and verify that all of those ranges are correctly assigned. Having an independent source, like using the GIS approach here, can really obviously detect, yeah, those street ranges are wrong, and someone needs to go in and fix them. Some have to do with the property of the data themselves, and this is a rather esoteric example, but it actually happened. The census geography itself gets updated. And so throughout the decade, the census is looking at modifying and having more accurate boundary data. And in this particular case, what happened was that these are the original census block boundaries in red, and these updated ones are in black. And between the time of this update, there was a redistricting, and this district boundary line here, which was defined in census geography, shifted. I know this is like too much, but the census blocks shifted. The district boundary line should have shifted too, but this particular jurisdiction had created their boundary lines back during the original redistricting, back when we had the red boundary lines. They're coming from the Census Bureau, and they had defined their geography, their districts in terms of census geography, and then they never updated. And so when the census geography shifted, the election officials did not update the district boundaries. And legally, these people in blue right here are misassigned to a district because they are in a census block that under law is they're in this district, but because the census has updated their geography, they got shifted out. And on top of everything else that's going on here, if this just like so multiple failures happening, the census, the election officials are using a GIS algorithm to geocode, and they're using the updated black boundaries to do their to define where people are within their districts. And so it was just multiple failures of using data at different points in time when it's being updated, and failure to update the data ends up with an error. We've seen, I've given you some example of some random human error. We've seen instances where what happens when a road is diverted for some reason because construction happens. And we've had discussions with people who say, well, if we're using meets and bounds in the road, or even census geography, because census geography often follows roads, if that road is diverted, we just shift the geography over, and we just move people to the new the district as warranted. And so if your house, for some reason, the road was going down one stretch and it gets curved around that, all of those people will get shifted into a new district, even though the legislature may have not intended for that group of people to be within that area. at this point, that's never happened to a candidate, but you can imagine at some point in time, it could actually happen to a candidate as well, as far as we're aware of. And then the other issue that really comes up, and this, by the way, was happening in North Dakota, if you were following news with Indian reservations or Native American reservations there, how they don't really have physical addresses. They use post office boxes, and these sorts of locations like reservations, military bases, student dorms, they tend to be actually hard to geocode, and yet we came up with our own geocoder to deal with these particular problems. And that was essentially what the activists were doing in North Dakota as well. They were going out there and creating physical addresses and latitude and longitude points for homes where none had existed before on those reservations. So again, your geocoders, if you're using these for your, when I'm talking to the election officials in the room, if you're using geocoders to do your own checks, you need to be aware that these geocoders don't work very well in all use cases. So what recommendations do we make is that we would say that you should periodically audit your assignment of voters to districts using this method. Use multiple geocoders because we find that works best in terms of your coverage, and of course of some of the issues about legacy data that don't get updated in voter files as quickly as you do in commercial databases. We'd like to have better data collection of boundaries, both district and precinct boundaries at all levels of government. There's another project that I've been working on. It's called District Builder. It's an open source redistricting platform that's been used in a few jurisdictions officially, and it's been used by advocates across the country as well. I believe that could be used for not only redistricting, but for re-precincting. You could have a centralized database to do this one time at the state level, just have one instance to do all of the data work. That would lead you to have better data integrity, and you can match this up more easily with the data that your voter registration data if you're geocoding it, because collecting, we've looked at this in terms of state legislative district boundaries. We have no clue what's going on at the local level, and collecting local boundary data is incredibly difficult. We've had a project doing that as well, and there are lots of challenges where we're just getting, literally in some cases, crayon maps of boundaries. And so having better data integrity would be really wonderful with this. For the election officials, I can also tell you, and government officials, is that the GIS companies right now make their money by selling their product to each local government when they're doing re-precincting or redistricting, and the site licenses for those that software runs up to like $10,000, and so they make millions of dollars by having a product that doesn't have this feature that we've created for our own open source software, which is that you only need one piece of software to run and only one database to run all your redistricting within a state, and so we can bring down the cost considerably at the same time. But I also know that there's this challenge where the local governments have their revenue and their budgetary concerns, which isn't the same as the state. And so some states just say, well, it's not our problem because each local government is responsible for their own redistricting. And I should also mention, as I'm talking about this, that Micah Altman, my colleague, has been my collaborator on this District Builder effort over the last decade or so, and as well as a company called Azavia, a GIS company called Azavia in Philadelphia. One last thing, where do we go from here? First of all, I think we can do this same approach to verify that people are assigned to precincts correctly. We're only doing it districts right now. And where I want to go with this is that so you can also, I believe, identify address errors in your voter registration files. Because if you have somebody who's located, here's the precinct that they're supposed to be located, but they're geocoded way out here, it's likely then that what's going on is that you may have flipped 2 digits in a street address, and you're just and doing your data entry, and that's why you have this person geocoded. It's not necessarily an error in terms of the voter being in the wrong district. It's that the address itself is in error, and so. I think that we could use this technique to identify address errors as well and help clean up those sorts of errors. Will make better communication with voters, between election officials and voters. And then lastly on this, and I'll make the same sort of pitch that Michael Alvarez was making, is that I would love to work with election officials on this. And the good news is a couple days ago, we received a grant to collect all of the voter files in the country from the states. And but we don't have a lot of money to do this verification process. So actually zero. But I'd still like to work with you if possible. And so because when we identified these errors across different jurisdictions in the country, we did not run out to the media. We worked with the election officials to fix the problem. The problem was fixed. They recognized the problems. And so I'd much be in that situation where we are proactively going out and fixing these problems before they become news stories in the media, because an election outcome was affected by these errors. And so, I'd be very eager to talk with any of the election officials in the room about how we can work with you to improve the integrity of your data. Thank you. Okay. You don't have to get up.
Well, thanks. I'd like to just start by thanking Charles and Jennifer and everyone else for actually inviting us to be part of this, because it seems really unlikely that the Center for Civic Design would be part of a convening on audits. And maybe I should just start by telling those of you who may not know us a little bit about what we do. We start from the idea that democracy is a design problem. So while you're up in the sky looking at the big view of the earth, we're kind of down in the weeds looking at the forms and the procedures and the minutia of how we run an election. And we come to this with an almost entirely qualitative approach, which is understanding how an individual voter or an individual election worker understands what they're doing and uses the artifacts and the procedures that we give them to complete their part of the process of running an election. And so, as we said in the beginning, we work on things like ballot design, and we work on things like ballot record forms, the hardest form we've ever worked on, I think, for all the reasons. And so when I think about audits, I had a different slide yesterday, but Philip gave me the best quote to use for this slide, which is that an audit is no better than the paper trail it uses. And so I wanted to talk to you about some of the things that we see about the starting artifact, which is the ballot. Because you would think that a ballot is easy. And in fact, we hear a lot of people say, if I can see it, it's self-verifying because I can see what I'm doing. And we have a lot of evidence that paper ballots are not the rather perfect artifact that we seem to talk about as though they are, and that there are a lot of ways in which ballots can in fact fool voters. Back in 2008, Larry Norden brought a group of us together at the Brennan Center to look at, it was a very qual project because we looked at elections, actually I say we, but the political scientists on the team looked at elections in which there were some sort of anomalous results where it wasn't clear why the election had gone the way it had gone. And then we all looked together at the ballots and the rest of the election to see if we could figure out what it was. And independently, in almost all the cases, we came up with something about the ballot design that we thought could have induced that problem. There's something else about ballots and thinking about the usability of ballots, which is that we're often saying to people, you know, your experience isn't the experience of all voters, but I think that applies even to, can I have a tissue? I seem to have scratched myself. That applies actually also to even experts in the field. Because when we showed those ballots to people who were forms designers but were not experts in elections and said, what has gone wrong here, they weren't able to identify what might have happened as a result of that ballot. But when we said, here's what happened, and asked them to help us explain that, they were able to say, oh yes, I can see now that this might have been the problem. And so I think that we don't have enough expertise in general in the world in understanding the linkage between how people approach marking a ballot and the design that can go into it. And so we think we're one of the people that's out there that's done it, because we spend most of our time watching voters do things or watching other people do things. I want to just look at a couple of these ballots that I think have fooled voters. The big one on the right is actually one of the worst problems that we've identified. This happens to be a California ballot from the 2014 primary, where there were 35 candidates for senator, but we had 2 more races this year in the primary. Luckily, the general does not include that in California. Luckily, in all 3 cases, there were wide margins. But Minneapolis had a 35-candidate contest for mayor, also, again, luckily wide margins, even with ranked choice voting. And it turns out that when you have the candidates in the ballots divided into 2 chunks, whether that's 2 columns or 2 rows, or there's a split between them or anything else that divides them up, there are some number of people who will think, oh, I should vote once in each place, especially if they're not really sure who they're going to vote for, and they start searching for a name, and this name seems likely, and then they get to the second half, and there's the name they really wanted, and all these sort of different sort of conversations go on in their head. And you end up with an overvote because it's an overvote. The top of the middle up here is from Michigan. Is it this one? Yeah. So this is an open primary state. There's others that do this, where because you don't have to ask for the ballot for the party you're voting for, you get a ballot that has both parties on the same ballot, and you are supposed to choose which party to vote in. I talk about this in UX circles, and almost everywhere someone says, I'm not supposed to vote on both sides. I mean, these are people who are, in that top percentage of people who know something about elections, have showed up at a talk about elections, for God's sakes, and they're not in elections, and they have been voting for years incorrectly because they didn't understand the rules of that ballot. The one in the middle is an electronic screen from Sarasota County, where because they broke the rhythm of the election rhythm was that there was 1 contest on each page, and people kept paging through, and they get to the congressional race, which is the little 2 candidates up there at the top, and a big race below it with a nice big header, and when you see a nice big header, you sort of ignore everything above it, and we had thousands of undervotes. And down at the bottom, a little hidden, is a state where the marking target is on the right, vastly separated from the ballot, and looks honestly like you should be voting in the red, for the next column over. So all of these things about how we connect ink marks on dead leaves, and then use a bit of geography on the paper to turn that into a vote, have some problems to them. And we saw this, this election. We got a lot of nice press because there was a bad thing that happened in an election. It's kind of a bittersweet moment for us. But Broward County followed the election guidelines in their state. In Florida, there are, in fact, ballot standards. And those ballot standards are done for each voting system that's certified in the state. And the ballot standard, if you go look at it, shows for this ballot type, it shows a little nice short bit of English text over in the left. But the difference is that their instructions stopped about here. Right, there was like maybe an inch of instructions. And here we have 3 languages. They go all the way down the page. And you can think of all the reasons why someone might not have noticed that contest down at the bottom, including that the ballot is long enough that if in a small voting booth, it's actually hanging over the edge. You get to Spanish and you think, okay, I'm done. It's into the other languages. There are all these things that happen about the fact that we skip. People who are high-functioning readers skip when they think they know what's going on. They think, right, got it, move on. People who are poor readers skip when they think this is too hard to read, I've finished it. People who are jumping between languages skip. So there are all kinds of different reasons why giving people an opportunity to skip that will also let them jump past a contest is a really bad idea. And the really, really sad thing about this is that we actually know the answers. There is virtually nothing I've been asked about elections in the past couple of years, not entirely nothing, I'll talk about that in a minute, where we don't actually have some of those answers. The picture over here on the side is the EAC's best practices ballot designs. Those were published in 2007. And you will notice that there is no contest under the instructions. I have to thank Andrew Appel because the guidelines mostly didn't say it, but he found where they actually did say it. But so this is actually a good guideline hidden in an unusable document and not making it really clear. So we have all of this evidence about what we should be doing. But I would also say that one of the challenges in elections is that mostly they just tick along. Mostly you know about how many candidates you're going to get, and it worked last time, and it just keeps ticking along. And so while we are very big on checklists of what to do, we are not very good about checklists about what to watch out for. Right? All of a sudden, you have too many candidates. All of a sudden, you have a third language or a second language. All of a sudden, something has changed, and has that changed how people might interact with that ballot? In California, in the 2014 primary, the ballot layout person for one of the counties was kind of the hero because she figured out that while you couldn't fit 35 candidates in a one column on the front of the ballot, because there's all that header information and some pretty big chunky bits of awful text that California requires, you could in fact fit them on the back of the ballot. And so the front of the ballot had the presidential primary that you'd picked, or no, or nothing, and a big arrow and a message that said, turn your ballot over, and started to the Senate because you couldn't change the ballot order. But at least we got it all into one column. And there was some, we did do a little data, and asked some people to do some data analysis, and it turned out that there were two things that increased the likelihood of overvotes. One was whether it was in one column or two, and the other was whether it was centrally counted or counted at the precinct. Right, so did you have a good, well-designed ballot, and did you have a chance for the voter to check and verify and be notified of a problem in a timely, contemporaneous way? And at the worst, it hit 4.7%, and at the best, it was 0.7. Right, so it's a pretty big range. Thank you to Kimball and Croft for doing that analysis work for us. So paper ballots, it's important to have paper. Not saying we shouldn't have paper. We absolutely need a paper record. We need something to count, something to audit, something to look back at, because without those paper ballots in Broward County, we would not know whether it was the machine misbehaving or something that happened as a result of the voters. Now, it is tragic that it looks like something happened as a result of the ballot fooling voters, but without doing over that election, there's nothing that we can do about it. But at least we know that it's not a counting problem, or it's not a recording problem. So maybe the answer is that we need to think better about what a better paper trail would be. Paper trails that have less ambiguity and fewer squirrel monkeys and hanging chads and all the rest of the things that seem to come along with paper. And I think that we can change the way we think about a ballot if we change the way we think about the act of marking a ballot. We think about it, I think, often as someone goes into a private location, they have a little conversation with themselves. Oh, I want to vote for Claire. Where's Claire's name on the ballot, right? We find Claire's name on the ballot and we mark that thing. And because we're very conscious of who we want to vote for, we recognize whether we've marked or not. But maybe the conversation should go like this. Voter comes in. There's a little conversation between the ballot and the voter in which the voter sort of says what they want to do, and the ballot then can confirm back that they heard them correctly, right, before they have to cast that ballot, before they even have to go to having the whole thing scanned. So we've all been using some bad metaphors, so here's mine, which is that we think about if a menu is a giant list, is just like a giant diner menu, then a ballot is sort of the selections you've made. But it's not enough to just say it's the selections you made. It's the selections you've made and the selections you didn't make, right? The places where you didn't take the opportunity to vote for something. And maybe that ballot should be as simple as the thing you were voting for, the contest you were voting for, the rules of the road, or at least the short version of that, who you voted for, and the name and whether you didn't vote. And I've actually included the words you voted for, copying the Oregon alternative ballot, because then when I scan this, or when I use text-to-speech for a blind voter or a low vision voter or someone in a second language, it actually reads out a sentence, right? There's an entire conversation there. You did this, here's what I heard you do, and here's how it will be counted. So we get this multiple checks. We get the check that happens as you actually make the mark. We get the check that happens maybe on a review screen. We get the check that happens at the ballot itself. And maybe we get the check as it's scanned, right? So there's a whole lot of moments for someone to realize there's a mistake going on. It's easier for people who are low literacy to read. It's easier for people who are rushing to read, because you don't see the thing, and it explains how the voting system is interpreting your actions through the rules of the election into a vote. I'm going to take my last 2 minutes to talk about election workers. Because they are people too. They are understudied in the literature. They show up in the VVSG in a sort of "and election workers" kind of way, because there are fewer of them than there are voters. And yet, once again, we know a lot about how to create good procedure, about how to create good instructions. We know that is literature that's been out there for years, even well beyond our time, and we can make complex interactions or complex procedures make sense even with them. And I want to do a 30-second mind experiment with all of you. Just this: if you have a piece of paper in front of you, use it, otherwise do it mentally. I want you to draw an upside-down T and put a triangle on top of it. Got it? How many people drew a wine glass? Or something like that. How many people drew a Christmas tree? Right. So here's the difference, and this is work that Pressman did in '38, I think. If I say we're all going to draw some Christmas trees, draw an upside-down tree, put a triangle on top of it, we will end up with a forest of things that look like a children's drawing of a Christmas tree. Because if you tell an adult what they're doing, what the goal is at each stage, then they can perform the actions more accurately. And I think I have looked at a lot of poll worker materials, and Philip, I'm really sorry, looked at your instructions yesterday, and we saw the same problem, right? Which is that you'd gotten the procedure down, you'd gotten the step-by-step down, but you didn't have that big picture in it. And I think that a lot of whether it's end-to-end, or whether it's risk-limited audits, or whether it's any of the other procedural things that we do, because elections are entirely about procedure, that if we can actually begin to give people a sort of guidepost through those moments, we will actually have better understanding without having to explain the math, right? I think most people will trust there was a calculation here and it was based on margin of victory, and here's the number you're going to use. And that might be sufficient to get them through the accurate procedure. And then we know that there's math underneath it, and if somebody wants the math, they can dig in and they can learn all about the math, whether they can do that by just talking to Josh or whether they have to go get a PhD to be able to understand a word he says. Right? Sorry. I thought you did marvelously today, by the way. So given that we're engaged in this giant procedural thing that happens under stress of politics, under stress of time, run by an army of semi-volunteers with underfunded administrators and administrators who don't always have the resources they need, if we can make the base materials from every form that we use, every procedure that we use, usable, accessible, and clear, democracy works better for everyone. And that's my pitch.
So we're at time. Charles has given me 5 minutes to allow a couple questions. Is that a couple questions? Questions, not speeches, please. Professor Mebane, and we'll come down here to Cook County. Yes. Will. Walter.
Quick two-part question. One to Whitney: is it going to be a real problem that we'll have 40 candidates in the Democratic presidential primary in 2020? Is it really that the Census Bureau can reallocate voters just by their bureaucratic changes? That seems to me to be unconstitutional, or should be.
Well, is it going to be a real problem that we have 40 candidates? It's great that we're seeing more people running for office. It's a wonderful thing. I think we're going through a period where there's a lot of instability, and it's going to show up in a lot of different ways. And the question isn't whether it's a real problem. The question is whether we recognize that 40 candidates is going to be a problem, because there are going to be a lot of names, and some names are going to look alike, and some names are going to be hard to spell, and it's going to be a big list of candidates, and that we start preparing for that and are ready to deal with it now and have some good ideas for it. We can't decide, I can't decide that we shouldn't have that many people running in a primary. That's not my decision, but the ballot design might be.
I will say, Walter, Rob Ritchie and I have written about this. Think about this, 45 days before the first primary, the military and overseas ballots will go out, and some candidates sometimes withdraw, sometimes. Yeah. Anyway.
Yes.
Michael, so the second question was to Michael, I believe, about the census redistricting people. That's interesting.
Yeah, we call it administrative redistricting because that's functionally what's happening. And yes, it is in violation of the state laws when you move voters in a way that is contrary to the legislative definition of what the boundaries are. So yes, that is a legal issue, and that's why it needs to get fixed. I don't think that the Census Bureau is necessarily doing it. And we should know this. I mean, big data causes opportunities for small errors, and those can be lots of small errors, and they can accumulate in strange ways. And so I think it's just over-reliance on certain data and technologies can lead you to have error, and but there are ways, I think, to fix that too. And so in the case I was giving there was just a multiple number of failures of people not understanding that the data had changed, but they one component of the way in which they are assigning voters to districts, they had updated their databases, but they hadn't updated the other component of it, and so that led to an error. But we detected it, and it got fixed, and so that's the good news.
Will, right?
Yeah, Bill.
Chicago, Bill,
Bill.
Chicago, and I see something in your hand.
It's a ballot.
Chicago ballot from November, we had 49 candidates on one side. By the way, I'm giving away a little of my speech. This is what voters in Chicago got in November. Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. So it's a lot of fun in Chicago.
Is that a question?
No, that was an answer to the last one. But Josh, if voters can then later, go on their smartphones and verify who they voted for, is that the mechanics of it?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
And I get this question constantly, no matter how clear I try to be about it. It's not the case that a voter can walk away and show somebody else how they voted.
This is the question.
The process is, in these systems, that voters do walk away with a receipt. The receipt is like a UPS tracking code. It has a number that corresponds to the encryption. It does not tell anybody how they voted. When voters are voting in person, they can check and confirm that the receipt matches their selections. But once they leave, all they have is a receipt that they can use to determine that their selections have not been changed from the time they had an opportunity to confirm them. Ask me later. I'll pull out a deck of cards. I'll show you how it works.
Okay. I again, being from Chicago, the precinct captain says, "Show me who you voted for."
Exactly.
Okay. Very good.
That would be terrible.
Or for that matter, your political science professor says, "Show me who you voted for."
Absolutely.
You want a break?
Of course,
Okay,
there are some
so we're
places
gonna-
where you can know.
We're going to take a break. You want us to be back here at quarter till?
Yeah, quarter till.
Quarter till, so we got about 10 minutes. Panelists are here. Thanks, everyone. Let's thank the panelists. Thank you so much.